read the Mayan Bible, the Popol Vuh, and, tried to delve into what they believed and what their civilization was like. And they had concepts, as we do, of heaven and hell, of punishment or reward.
Most people assume the Bible has always existed in one fixed form, as if it were decided once and then left untouched. But that's not really how it happened. When you start looking into it, you realize there has never been a single universal version. Different Christian traditions ended up with different collections of books, and the differences are not small. Some have 66 books, others have more, and then some versions go far beyond what most people have ever seen. And that's where things start to feel a little uncomfortable, because it raises a question people don't usually ask. Not what the Bible says, but who decided what it was allowed to say. Some of those books are the ones that make people stop when they hear about them today. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah. Inside the Ethiopian tradition, these texts were never strange or controversial. The Book of Enoch makes for a good example. In most Bibles, Enoch gets a single line and then vanishes. But in this text, his story opens up into something far larger. Angels descend to earth, pass on knowledge that was never meant to reach human hands, and a kind of deep corruption spreads across the world as a result. One book in the New Testament even quotes Enoch almost word for word, which tells you the text was known, read, and respected at some point in early Christian history. And yet it didn't survive into the versions most people read today. Then, centuries later, fragments of it turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Multiple copies written in ancient languages, preserved in caves, dating back to before the time of Jesus. Ethiopia simply chose a different direction. And because of that, it held onto something the rest of the world gradually let go of, which is what makes the question it raises feel less like ancient history and more like something still worth sitting with today. And now take a step back and really think about what these changes mean. In this telling, the resurrection is not just an event, it's a return. And if that's how early Christians were seeing it, even partially, then the story we usually hear might only be the surface. The empty tomb, the appearances, and the ascension might be the parts people could witness. What's interesting is that this wasn't some hidden text no one had heard of. The Ascension of Isaiah was known. Early Christian writers mention it. People like Jerome and Epiphanius of Salamis were aware of it. It circulated, it was read. But like the Book of Enoch, it didn't make it into the versions that became standard in most of the world, except in one place. In Ethiopia, it stayed. It wasn't pushed aside or forgotten, it was copied, preserved, and treated as part of the same sacred tradition as everything else, and that naturally leads to a question that doesn't really have a clean answer. If these texts had remained part of the wider Christian world, would the way people understand the story today feel different? Not necessarily wrong or right, just different. And this is where people usually get uncomfortable, because it starts to touch on something most people assume was simple.
You got all those books, the Bible, you've got the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with. Half the time, they didn't even need to read the subtitles. They could look at it and know what was going on.
The Bible didn't come together all at once. There wasn't a single moment when someone sat down and decided everything. It took time, a lot of it. Early Christians didn't even have what we now call the New Testament. They had older Jewish scriptures, and then they had letters, teachings, and accounts of Jesus that moved from place to place. Different communities held onto different texts. What one group read regularly, another might not even know about. As time went on, that started to become a problem. Different ideas were spreading, different interpretations. Some groups were forming their own collections of texts, and slowly there was pressure to bring some kind of order to it. Not necessarily to control it, but to define it. To decide what represented the core message. One of the people who played a role in that process was Athanasius of Alexandria. In the 4th century, he wrote a list of books that matches the New Testament people read today. That moment is often pointed to as important, but it didn't instantly settle everything. It still took years of discussion, different councils, and gradual agreement across regions before that list became widely accepted. And even then, it wasn't universal. Some traditions kept different collections. The Ethiopian Church continued with its broader canon. Other regions had their own variations for a long time, so what we now think of as fixed was actually shaped slowly over generations through conversations, disagreements, and decisions. And those decisions were not made in isolation. They were influenced by where people were, what language they were using, and which communities held more influence at the time. Texts written in Greek had a better chance of spreading widely. Texts preserved in other languages, like Ge'ez, stayed more localized. Ideas that aligned with what was becoming widely accepted were easier to include. Ideas that felt harder to fit were more likely to be set aside. That doesn't mean the process was dishonest. Most of the people involved believed they were doing the right thing. They were trying to preserve what they saw as the truth, but at the same time, history always works this way. Some voices get amplified, others fade out. Not because they were necessarily wrong, but because they didn't carry the same weight in that moment. And sometimes, the only reason something survives is that someone, somewhere, refuses to let it disappear. In northern Ethiopia, high in the mountains, there are monasteries built in places that don't even look reachable. Places like Debre Damo. You don't just walk into them, you climb. Sometimes using ropes. Sometimes along narrow paths where there's nothing beneath you but open air. They were built this way on purpose. Not for difficulty, but for distance. To stay apart from the outside world. For centuries, monks lived there almost the same way, growing their own food, praying, and copying texts by hand. The language they used, Ge'ez, hasn't changed in the way modern languages do. It stayed close to its original form, which meant the texts stayed close too, and that isolation ended up doing something unexpected. While the rest of the world was changing, debating, editing, and standardizing, these places stayed still. And because they stayed still, what they held onto didn't get reshaped. It was simply preserved. In early 2021, during the conflict in northern Ethiopia, places that had gone untouched for centuries were suddenly exposed. Debre Damo, that ancient monastery that people could only reach by climbing a rope, was hit. Soldiers made their way up and didn't just pass through, they took things. Monks and nuns reported thousands of manuscripts carried away, not copies, but originals, handwritten pages that had survived over 1,000 years. Ancient crosses disappeared alongside them. Then some of those manuscripts started appearing online, quietly listed and sold for prices that didn't reflect what they actually were. It was a continuous line of preservation that had held steady for 1,500 years, broken almost overnight. Even so, what remains is still enormous. Ethiopia still holds tens of thousands of manuscripts inside churches, monasteries, and private collections. Researchers from institutions like the University of Hamburg and the British Library have been working to digitize as much as possible, almost like a race against time. Because most of these manuscripts are still exactly where they have always been in the hands of the Church. The texts still exist, not as distant theories, but as living pages inside a tradition that